So for guys, the way I like to explain it, it's like the difference between a home field game and an away game. When the conversation gets emotional, it's an away game. I've lost my home field advantage. I don't really understand what's going on, and mostly I don't understand what's expected of me. I get very confused about what it is my partner wants from me.
So would you say men suffer from loneliness at higher rates than women?
Absolutely. No question.
Really?
There's all kinds of data to support that. And not to be overly dramatic about it, but if you look at the psychological profiles of most of the mass shooters, first of all, they're all guys. I don't think we've had a single woman mass shooter yet. And second of all, they're almost all extremely isolated, lonely people. And there's a lot in the culture now which is not so committed to that, which takes a pretty negative, critical take towards men. And I think that gets in the way of a lot of intimate relationships.
All right, this is another episode of Verbal Artwork with Mr. Rembrandt. Of course, I'm Mr. Rembrandt, and we have a special guest here today. It's going to be a great episode. The guest that we have today is Dr. Avrum Weiss. Dr. Avrum Weiss is an author of 4 books called Hidden in Plain Sight, Living, Loving Mutually, Change Happens, Experimental Psychotherapy. He is a psychologist, he's a Psychology Today contributor, which is a well-known website that publishes many psychological papers. He's also nationally recognized for his work on his experiential therapy, as well as he likes to focus a lot on new understanding of the internal lives of men, so this can better help men and women. So, with that small introduction, I'm glad you're here, Mr. Avrum. If you would like to add a little bit more background to the viewers, that would be excellent. Thanks for being here.
Sure. Yeah, just Avrum is my first name. It's a long
Avrum,
name.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Background, I have an unusual background in that I've been a therapist since I was 17 years old. It's a very boring career path. I've been doing the same thing for over 50 years. And my work is focused on understanding men in the last 10 or 15 years. And it's been a very interesting ride. It has put me at odds with some people of my profession, but I don't mind that at all.
Excellent. So why specifically have you focused specifically on men?
I think I would, if I were honest, I'd probably say I have a bit of an oppositional personality. I tend to like to look into things that nobody else is paying attention to. So I wrote a book about change, which you would think that there have been 1,000 books written about change by psychologists, but actually there are very few. And there's almost no training in graduate school about what so I get interested in things that I think are important that people are overlooking. And that's a good description of men in my field. Well, I'd say in the culture at large. Men are, although clearly dominant in many ways in terms of privilege and power, in terms of really understanding men, we're really just in the last 20 years really starting to get interested in kind of what makes men tick. So that interests me because I'm interested in important things we're not paying attention to.
Great. Yes. So I would say that it does appear that you are accurate with your direction in which you say you've looked into men and looked into things that maybe other people have not looked at in the same exact way. And we're going to go into some of those topics so people will understand exactly what we're talking about. Specifically, you've had some articles on your website that you've published with Psychology Today, and I've had the chance to review some of those articles. And we're going to go over those articles and some questions involving them.
Okay.
So one question I'll start off with is you talk about men's reaction in relationships, how they deal with women. And so my first question revolving around that is, why do men get so emotionally withdrawn in arguments, specifically with women, so to speak?
That's a big question, and I'm happy to tackle it, but it's complicated. So first of all, let's start by saying that most of your listeners, if they're in a heterosexual relationship, would very quickly identify with the pattern in which many arguments in heterosexual couples go,
Great.
which is
Yes.
that it starts with the woman being the one to say, this thing is the little bubbles. I
No
can't remember how
worries.
to turn. All right. It starts usually with the woman bringing up some kind of dissatisfaction. And I think that gets unfairly characterized as women being complaining. But I don't think it's about being complaining. I think it's about women are generally the ones who are more tuned into what's going on in the relationship. So this is a silly example, but I'm sitting here, I heat with wood in my home. I'm sitting here looking out at my wood pile. If you ask my wife right now how much wood we have left, she couldn't tell you at all. She hasn't a clue. She doesn't go out here. She doesn't look at it. That's something that I pay attention to. It matters to me. But in a lot of couples, if you ask the guy, how's the relationship going? His answer would basically be about, well, if we're not fighting, everything's fine. But there's probably not a lot of aspirational thought from the man. There's probably not a lot of attention to how are we doing in terms of our emotional connection, and are we talking about things that are hard to talk. That's more likely to be the woman who's tracking that stuff, in the same way that she's more likely to be the one tracking what's going on with the kids and a lot of other things. So it's more likely to be the woman who brings up something to talk about, something about the relationship that she's unhappy with. 9 times out of 10, no matter how carefully the woman brings up the topic, the man is going to hear it as criticism. It's sort of remarkable how often men, even when the woman is really working hard to not criticize him and to be pretty even-handed and not blaming about it, men often hear that as being criticized. And the reason for that is that men are really socialized to believe that they're responsible for their partners and their family's happiness. And so this is where you get the saying, if mom ain't happy, nobody's happy. Happy wife,
Yes.
happy life. Because men are taught to believe that if their partner is unhappy, it means they're failing in some way. So from the woman's perspective, she's innocently saying, honey, we haven't been spending as much time together. Maybe we could, have lunch together once a week or not. And in his mind, it's you're failing. You're inadequate as a man. You're not spending enough time with me. And he's immediately goes on the defensive. She sort of innocently has brought something up to talk about. He's getting reactive and defensive and maybe a little angry. So she gets more emotional. Now I'm coming to your question about why men withdraw, because most men are not as emotionally fluent or emotionally comfortable as their female partners. And so the more emotional the conversation gets, the more uncomfortable they get. So for guys, the way I like to explain it, it's like the difference between a home field game and an away game. So when the conversation gets emotional, it's an away game. I've lost my home field advantage. I don't really understand what's going on. And mostly I don't understand what's expected of me. I get very confused about what it is my partner wants from me. And so since I don't really know the rules and I don't trust the ref and I don't think I'm going to get a fair shake, I withdraw. I just pull back because I'm uncomfortable. And of course, that just throws fuel on the fire because the woman started this conversation trying to make some kind of connection. And for some reason that makes no sense to her, the guy's now withdrawing. So I'm getting the opposite. I'm trying to talk about connecting. You're withdrawing and I get more emotional, which makes the guy withdraw more. And these arguments spiral up because they're not understanding these sort of basic truths about each other and are really misunderstanding where their partners come.
Okay, so I'm going to ask another question, and then I'm going to ask you some other questions, diving a little bit deeper into that answer and the answer based upon this question. So based upon the fact that men do become emotionally withdrawn due to these conversations, whether conversations of contentiousness or civility, you've used the word fear as a result of men's feelings towards these situations. And men, I would just qualify this question a little bit and then get you to respond. I would say that some men would feel uncomfortable by the answer that men are in fear of their spouse due to pride or ego reasons, just to be
Sure.
honest.
Most men are
And
uncomfortable with that idea.
yes, so my question is, it fear of undesired outcomes that may occur, which to me appears to be more of like avoidance, or is it fear of harm? Because that's usually what people would associate fear with, fear of danger or fear of harm.
But I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. I think you're spot on. I think both are involved. You know, if all you have to do is spend 15 minutes on the internet to read the places that men are afraid of harm by women, it's difficult for women to understand because men are bigger, stronger, make more money, have more power. Why would a man be afraid of harm by a woman? But they're not understanding the vulnerability that so many men experience. So if you think about it, in couples you know or in your own life who've split up, who is it who gets busy dating fastest, men or women, after a breakup?
I would say men get back at it faster.
Much faster than women. So why is that? You know, if men sort of like to think of themselves as not needing a woman, why is it that they're the ones who feel such a sense of urgency to get back into a relationship? Because I think that men's dependency and need for women, which is the case in any relationship, there's an interdependency, but men are less aware of their own need for a partner and less comfortable with that need. And so they're more reactive to it, more pushing it away, more denying that it exists. But we know it's true because we see what happens when couples break up. The women are usually fine. They're like, yeah, I think I'll be single for a while. But the guys are very uncomfortable often and will start looking around for somebody else pretty quickly.
Interesting. So my question is, when it comes to those two questions that you answered, why is it that men would feel that they're much more capable of communicating with other men, and they feel as communication with other men seems to be more tenable than communicating with, let's say, their female spouse or partner, for example?
It's a great question. And the simplest answer, which I'll then fill in, but the simplest answer is that other men are not the same gender as their mother. And if you're heterosexual, your partner is. So imagine a newborn baby. Human infants are noteworthy for being more dependent than almost any other animal. If you've ever seen another animal being born, you see a horse being born, it gets up and runs off, you know, almost as soon as it can move around, it can feed itself. It's pretty independent. Human infants are entirely dependent on their caregivers. They can't do anything for themselves. And that includes being emotionally dependent. So there's this marvelous old social psych experiment called the still face experiment. And in this experiment, you have a split screen like you and I are on now, and you have a mom and a baby playing with each other. And you can see the sort of conversation. It's not words, but you can see them going back and forth. The mom makes a smile, the baby responds, the baby does something cute. They got a thing going on, right? So in the experiment, the mom is instructed to have a still face. Not angry, not critical, not just unexpressive. And do you have any idea what happened to the babies when the mom does that? You think like no big deal, or what do you imagine would happen? Just like your face now, just still.
Yeah, I believe that they would not react in the same manner because they're very sensitive to the emotions.
Exactly. They're not just sensitive, they're completely reliant on their mothers engaging with them. So within a minute or two, all of these babies just became incredibly upset, so much so that some of them lost bowel and bladder control. Okay. So we start as little baby boys, very, very tuned into a woman, because for most people still, it's a mom that's doing the primary caregiving. We're very tuned into a woman, and we're paying very careful attention to what we need to do to get her to continue to pay attention to us. Interestingly, in that experiment, the boy babies actually got more physiologically distressed than the girl babies. And it took them longer to sort of get back to baseline. So then you fast forward to adulthood. And for men who are attracted to women, here is someone who is the same gender as my mom. And so it recreates the same dynamics, and men up it. And it's just like a grown up in the same situation. Men end up in that exact situation that they were in as infants, very, very tuned into a woman, very reliant on her approval and attention, very sensitive to any indication that she might not be attending or approving, and very reactive and very distressed at any indication that she's not. And it's remarkable. So we go from, if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy as a baby, to happy wife, happy life. And it's really not much has changed for guys.
So would you say that that has to deal with the outcome that would conclude that men have this hypersensitivity to criticism involving
Yes,
women?
absolutely.
Due to the parental factors with being a baby and a child and being
Yeah,
raised by their mothers.
sure. Because we are completely dependent on a woman caregiver during a period of life where we're completely dependent and cannot take care of ourselves. And then, add to that problem the fact that most men, when they start getting involved in serious relationships, probably don't have a lot of other forms of emotional support. Men tend to have fewer close friends than women do. So if a heterosexual couple, if they have a conflict, the woman has friends to go talk to. Probably the guy doesn't. Most situations, the guy doesn't. So it's all the eggs are in one basket for him. So he's more distressed and more urgent because that's it for him.
Yeah. So I would agree that men, and this has to do with apathy studies that I've seen, is that men do have smaller social circles than women do, as well as they are less emotional than, they're less emotional than women, like these studies have shown, and they are more apt to isolate in these studies as well. And from my understanding is the results show there's a difference in apathy when it comes to men and women, and it doesn't necessarily result as a conclusion that this is a problematic issue for men. They just score differently, and it shows a lot of evidence on how men and women are different, more so than a conclusion that men need to somehow increase their social circles. To me, it's more evidence that men are able to survive and withstand being in less social circles and are more comfortable with being isolated in comparison to women who rely and desire
Right.
on larger social circles.
There's only
So
one
what do you
problem
believe?
with there's only
Okay,
one problem with that logic. Well, first of all, I
sure.
want to go back to one thing you said, and I'll say it a little different. I don't think men are less emotional than women. I think men are less emotionally expressive than women, because I'm in therapy with men all the time, and my experience is men have just as many emotions as women do. It's just they're a little more hidden. So I don't
Okay.
think men are less emotional. But the problem with the formulation you just gave is that isolation and the lack of connection are bad for your health. So there's reams of data. This is one of the primary reasons that women live 7 years longer than men, is the lack of support. So, for example, loneliness is worse for your health than smoking cigarettes, believe it or not. So if you go to the doctor every year and you get your annual physical, he should be asking you, or she should be asking you, how are you doing with friends? Do you have close friends? Because they ask you, how much do you smoke and how much do you drink, which is good that they ask you that. But if they were just following the facts, they would also ask you, how's your relationship life? Because loneliness is deadly. Loneliness is a greater contributor to early mortality than smoke. You'd be better off smoking cigarettes and having close friends, which is not something we think about, but we know that's true. And of course, loneliness is also associated with depression and anxiety and self-harm and all kinds. So the problem is it's not good for you to be isolated. And I don't think that men are by nature isolated. I think that's how men have been taught to be, because again, I run therapy groups for men, and these men are very close and very connected with each other, and their connection with each other is very important to them. So I don't think that's a natural state for men. I think that's the way men have been socialized to be.
Really? Okay, so let me throw out some hypotheses and just take the other side of the opinion. So the fact that loneliness and not having quality social circles can affect you in a negative way, similar to that of smoking and or I believe obesity was one as well used as a factor. So is that a sign that mean that if you don't have quality social circles, that you're dying earlier, you're not living as long, or
Yes.
because someone has higher social circles, they're actually living longer? You know, two things. Which side
It's
of
two
the
sides of the
argument?
it's two sides of the same coin. What we know is that if you do not have close relationship with other people, it negatively affects your health to the point of causing that you won't live as long. That being partnered or and I don't think it has to be a romantic partner. I think you could have very intimate friends. So we're not just talking about sex or couples.
Correct.
We're talking
Right.
about connection with other human beings. And, we're basically, everything suggests that we're tribal creatures. We're not isolated. There are animals that live individually, and there are animals that live in tribes. We're one of the tribal. Throughout our history, this time in history is the anomaly. Most of human history, people have lived in groups, in communities. And the way we're doing it now is not good for us. And we have all kinds of data to support that. It's not good for your emotional health. It's not good for your happiness. And it's not good for your physical health either.
So let's say there's a young man, for example, who might have one or two close male friends, and let's say he likes to play video games and have the headset and have a little community of friends that he talks with where he plays video games. And that's his way of interacting with his one or two close friends and maybe some people online through the video games that he plays. And his day-to-day schedule can look as if he goes to work and he spends a lot of time isolated in a room, for example. And then we take another situation where a young lady, she might have a large social circle with different young ladies, maybe 5, 6, or 7, and they like to go shopping together and go out on weekends. Would that be an example of the young man not having enough of a social circle to where it's not aiding to higher longevity compared to the other young lady?
I think it would be, because the problem, it's nothing wrong with having friends you play video games with. That's a perfectly fine way. But the problem is, do you do anything but play video games together? Do you talk about yourself? Do you talk about your life? Is this someone? So probably not. Whereas the other end of your example, talking about women going out shopping and having lunch together, they are talking. They are connecting with each other. If you ask one of those women, well, what is going on in so-and-so's life? They'll tell you they know, because they're talking to each other. And so it's not the activities, it's how connected the people are. And my guess is that people who are playing online video games with each other don't really know each other very well.
Yeah. So the fact that young men might have a proclivity to have similar situations, similar social situations in that way compared to young women, is that a sign that men need to be proactive in finding more social interactions instead of engaging in a more apathy-based environment, which seems to be more natural? Because it seems more, the studies even show men are more have higher rates of apathy, in which they might engage in that example that I gave, rather than having it, going shopping and going to different maybe nightclubs together in large groups all the time, often. So you're saying men's natural proclivity in which they typically behave is not healthy for them, and they should probably be a little bit more proactive in higher social circles.
Yeah, except I don't think it's men's natural proclivity to isolate. I think I think human beings want to connect with other human beings, male or female. And that men have just been taught a lot of very unhelpful ideas about that. And so their
Really?
interest in connecting is pretty suppressed. But most men I talk with are very interested in having closer friends. They just don't have a clue how to go about that.
Yeah. So one more question, and then we're going to go into some other questions,
Okay.
some other topics.
Mhm.
Now, I'm just take this question for what it is, not coming at you in any type of way, but would you say that, because you used your experience as one, and your experience as a doctor in the realm is preeminent. Okay, let me say that first. But could that also give a type of viewpoint on this that is different from
Like
what
a
is
bias.
actually happening? Correct.
Like a bias. I
Correct,
mean,
because
sure,
you are
that's
dealing with
possible.
difficult men.
Sure. Of course, but the same as you have a bias, I have a bias, everybody has a bias. But let me give you a source of data about that.
Sure.
I wrote an article about men and loneliness for Psychology Today that's been viewed 1 million times. So kind of struck a chord somewhere. I don't think it was just women reading it. So I think there's a lot of guys out there who are reading this article who are resonating with what you and I are talking about, who are reading it saying, yes, that's me. I want to read this. This is important to me. So I don't think it's just my bias when 1 million people are taking the time to read the article. It's the most popular thing I've ever written was about men and loneliness.
Yeah. So would you say men suffer from loneliness at higher rates than women?
Absolutely. No question.
Really?
There's all kinds of data to support that. And, not to be overly dramatic about it, but if you look at the psychological profiles of most of the mass shooters, first of all, they're all guys. I don't think we've had a single woman mass shooter yet. And second of all, they're almost all extremely isolated, lonely people.
Yeah. Well, most of them are men, yeah, but there was one with the Catholic Church
Okay.
incidents.
Overwhelmingly, man.
But overwhelmingly, yes,
Yeah,
no
overwhelmingly,
question.
man. And almost always, routinely, very, very isolated. Because look, if your mind is so unwell as to think that shooting up a group of people is a good idea, and you had friends, somebody would probably say to you, we need to get you to a hospital. You're not
Course,
okay.
no question.
So the only way your thinking gets that far out of line is if you're not talking to anybody and nobody knows what's going on in your mind.
Incredibly interesting. From my research and talking with other individuals in the field, some of them might have taken the opposite opinion of yours. Yeah, a lot of nuance there, because data is data, but the explicit narrative is always that young women suffer from psychological illnesses at higher rates than men. As a personality trait, women are more neurotic, and typically as a clinical outcome conclusion disposition, women have more psychological illnesses than men. So when it comes to loneliness, the conclusion usually is women suffer more deeply and higher with loneliness than men do. So this is
Yeah,
a
I don't think
different
that's
take.
true at all. I think I also don't think that the data is not that women have more psychological illness than men. Women have different kind. Women and men tend to have different kinds of problems, but I don't think the data says that women have more psychological illness than men.
Neurosis. Yeah, on neurosis.
Yeah. I think it's more a question of different kinds. Women are more likely to be anxious, for example, than men. And men are more likely to be depressed and angry. So it expresses in different ways, but I don't think there's a big difference in the genders in that way.
Yeah. In depression, from what I saw, women suffer from depression, anxiety at higher rates than men do.
Anxiety, yes. There's a lot of interesting work about men and depression and about how depression is being underdiagnosed in men because it often takes the form of anger and irritability. So rather than sadness, which is often the case in women, for men, depression often takes the form of angry acting out. So, for example, men are much worse at taking care of themselves. They don't go to the doctor. They don't get preventive care, which is also part of the reason we don't live as long. And that kind of lack of self-care may also be connected to depression.
Interesting. Very interesting. So with this differences that men and women have in relationships, what could be done so that there could be a higher level of communication in relationships between men and women? Because, this is essential, this is needed, and this is healthy.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned, and I'm maybe a little embarrassed to say I didn't know it, but it was a big surprise to me, is how differently men talk to each other when it's just men in the room than they do when there are women in the room. So when I started doing therapy groups for men, I thought, this is a terrible idea. They're going to talk sports. They're going to talk politics. They're going to talk work. Nobody's going to open up and talk. But I don't mind saying I've never been more wrong. And in fact, the groups I do for men in many ways are more open and more vulnerable than the groups I do for men and women. So it was a great surprise to me, though I've been a man my whole life. It was a great surprise to me how hungry men are to connect with other men. And so the answer to your question is, I think the starting place, which was a surprise to me, for most guys, I think it's easier to start talking to other guys than it is to talk to a romantic partner. And so in the book, I have a chapter for guys who are interested in this stuff, in learning how to be more emotional, more open, closer to other people, and sort of walk them through a process of trying to get together with a group of other guys to be able to talk about these issues with. And basically what I'm suggesting is use the book as sort of a book club, get together a group of guys who want to read the book and use that as an opportunity to start a kind of community where men talk to each other about what's really going on inside.
Great. So when in a relationship, men are on the receiving end of issues or topics brought up with their spouse, and they're feeling as if it's uncomfortable or contentious. And then on the other hand, the wife or the spouse may believe that they're coming with a sense of openness and it's not contentious. What can be done to bridge that gap on men being more acceptant, or whether it is coming off contentious or not, it's coming from a place of care because this is somebody who cares about you? What can be done to bridge that gap so there's a lack of understanding there?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it's one that I deal with, probably every day. It's exactly the misunderstanding that you're talking about. So I would like to read you a quote by way of an answer.
Excellent.
So I did an interesting workshop. I did a workshop with men and women, not couples, just men and women who didn't know each other, for 3 days. And then 4 months later, we met again for 3 days. So in the intervening 4 months, they all went home to try to apply what we learned in the workshop to their relationships. And what's interesting is that the women were the ones who got the most out of it and made the most changes in their relationship. Even though the workshop was about men's fears of women, it's women who really took more of it home and made changes in their relationship. So this is a quote from one of the women in that workshop. She said, "I understand that my husband has not been ignoring, dismissing, or hurting me out of a lack of respect, as I suspected, but that he's scared. Scared to hurt me, scared to mess up with me, scared to not be enough. I had honestly never imagined that he was scared and that I was so profoundly important to him that he was constantly terrified I would leave him." So to your question, I think it starts with think when women understand, they see men's withdrawal and they misinterpret that as a power play. They think, oh, he's just being withholding to get the upper hand. And so they're irritated and they get aggressive and they pursue and they try, and which of course, when you get bigger with somebody who's feeling scared, they just get smaller, right? Imagine if you're standing in front of a 5-year-old kid and you get angry at them, then they're more scared, right?
Yes.
So the first thing that's helpful is when women understand that their partner is not being a jerk and not trying to pull a power play, but is scared, it really can be a game changer for women. So it can really move them from a position of being critical and angry and disapproving to a position of being more empathic and more compassionate. When they understand, it's sort of like understanding that changes a lot for women. So I think that's a really important part of the answer to your question, is that women understanding that is a tremendously helpful first step. And what people have told me they're doing, which I think is a great idea, it was not my idea, but a number of couples have told me that they're reading the book together, one chapter at a time. So in other words, like, you don't read the book and then when you're done, give it to me, which is usually how we do things, right? Mm-hmm. No, we each read chapter 1 and then we don't go to chapter 2 until we talk about chapter 1. And then we read chapter 2 and we don't go to chapter. And I think that's really been very helpful for couples, because a lot of what's happening is that the men are saying, yeah, that's what he's, those examples, that's me. That's what I've been trying to communicate to you. And the women are like, oh, why didn't you tell me this? I can't believe this. I'm married to you all these years. I didn't know this. But the book, I think, helps as a kind of translator. And then where there's more understanding, there's more compassion. So if we talk about between the sexes or between the races or between different countries, the conflict is exacerbated when we don't understand each other, when we have prejudices and stereotypes and we think we know where the other person is coming from. But understanding dissolves a lot of that. When you get to know somebody, gay marriage was a hot issue in this country, however many years ago, 20 years ago, let's say. And I thought to myself, we're never going to have marriage equality in this country. People are too scared of it. But what I didn't understand is that around the Thanksgiving table, in a lot of families, people were speaking up and saying to their grandparents and their uncles and their aunts, by the way, I'm gay. All these scary boogeymen that you're so afraid of, that's me. And then people were like, oh, well, I love you. You're a normal person. Maybe being gay isn't what I thought it was. Same thing can happen between men and women, that a lot of the stereotypes and sort of myths that we have, you start to open up more and start to learn more about each other. Same kind of understanding can happen.
Yeah, no, that's great. There's something I always say is more knowledge allows understanding, and understanding can lead to more happiness. Is something I love to say. And
that's a nice way of saying it.
And I like that example that you gave. It's something I do when I read books. For example, if I haven't had a high understanding of the chapter I read in a very comprehensive way, I'll read it over and over again before I move on. And I will even read the same book over and over again until I master it. I don't like to be the person who reads maybe 50 books in a year or 100 books in a year. And it's like, well, what really have you gained out of reading 50, 100 books in a year? It's probably better to take 5 great books and read them over and over again within the year. It become more useful. So I really do resonate with that a lot. And I really do like that a lot.
So it'd be great if couples would approach each other with the same values you approach a book. If a couple would approach each other like you are a book, a treasure full of information that I'm having trouble understand, but I'm going to keep reading. I'm not going to take the shortcut of critical judgments. I'm going to keep reading till I really understand you. So I didn't get it. Tell me again. What is it you think? How do you feel about that? If we would approach each other the way you approach a book, that'd be great.
Yeah. So I had a great question. I lost kind of the train of thought.
It'll come back to you. It'll come back.
Okay, yes. So are you familiar with John Gottman
Not
and
well,
his
but I
work?
know his work. Yeah.
Yeah, so
He's
he's a relationship expert. Him and his wife also do work together. They've done tremendous amounts of studies. They have a whole large organization that has made him appear as the number one person on relationships as far as his expertise. And one thing that is well known with his work that he says is 70% of relationship issues are perpetual and typically unsolvable. And if a couple knows how to understand that and deal with the fact that there are certain issues and ways about each other that they won't be able to change and they might not like, but that they accept, and that would be able to allow for a more better relationship of civility rather than trying to change the other person. What do you think about that?
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I can give you just to flesh it out for you a little bit. I think in that a lot of times what happens in any relationship is, if you and I were in a close friendship and you say something or you do something or you behave in a way that I don't like, what I'm really saying is you're triggering me. It's not that, I may say it to you as if you did something wrong, but it's not really that you did something wrong. It's that you did something that I had a reaction to. So let's say you tip 10%. Every time you go out to lunch, you only tip 10%. Well, my daughter's a server, and I don't like it when people tip 10%. I think it's cheap and they should tip more. Okay, so I'm mad at you. I think you're a cheapskate, and I have all these judgments about you. But if you don't know that my daughter's a server and, lives hand to mouth, dependent on people's tips, you wouldn't understand. So the problem is not that tipping 10% is wrong. The problem is that we're not understanding each other. You don't know. It's not that you're doing something wrong that has to change. The answer to the problem is not you should tip more. The answer to the problem is I should talk to you about my daughter and how worried I am that she won't be able to make ends meet, and that she's reliant on people who don't understand that their tips are the only, 90% of her. That's the solution. So people get hung up thinking for this relationship to get better, you have to tip more. That's not the issue. And I think that's what talking.
Yeah. Are you familiar with this understanding called covert contracts, which is all about that, saying that there's a lot of things in relationship where we have these covert expectations of our partners in which they don't even know what the expectation is.
Right, because they came from our families. Because I expect my wife to be a part of my family the family I came from, and she expects it to go the way it did in the family she came from. And so then when she doesn't do it the way I'm familiar with, then I think she's doing it wrong. But really, I just don't yet understand why she does it the way she does it.
Yes. Great.
And to say it in a positive way, that's what's exciting about relationships. Instead of, being judgmental and critical and thinking other people are doing things wrong, it's like going to another country. Some people go to another country and they head right for the McDonald's, right? Because they want everything to be the way that they're familiar with. And that's in a relationship, you criticize the other person when they don't do things the way you think they should be done. But you can also go to another country and say, what do the people eat here? I'd like to try the local food. I'd like to be a little more open and vulnerable and learn about something. So it's the same between men and women. Like, tell me how you think about that. Really? I would never think about it that way. Tell me more. Explain that to me. It's the same kind of opportunity to be a bigger person, to grow.
So one more question, and then I'm going to get a little bit into your experimental psychotherapy. Because that's something new to me. So my next question is with young men through a program that I used to work with, reentry program to help young men get back on their feet. One thing I noticed with a lot of the young men who were married is when they were having difficulties with their partner, specifically their wife, they were expressing that, their spouse had a lot of different concerns about a lot of different things. and they have altered or made effort to do those that their spouse wanted, but as of changing into doing those different things, it appears that their spouse has come up unsatisfied and has changed focus from now that new thing that they're doing to something else now that they're lacking. And this probably goes into a lot of men feeling that they're not living up to the expectation
Right.
of their wife. I know a lot of men typically, which I do understand, not only from experience, but just from being a man myself, that it feels like there's a jar of unfulfilled expectations that you cannot fill for your spouse, typically when it comes to women. So what do you believe is how a young man can either fill that jar and or be satisfied with the fact that is the situation in a relationship?
It's a very common pattern that you're talking about. And the answer is really to flip the tables, because what women are really asking for is not that you take out the garbage or paint the spare bedroom. What they're really asking for is that you be more of a partner with them in your lives together. And so there would be a lot less attention on the garbage and painting the spare bedroom if the man were more proactive about the relationship with his partner. So what I usually suggest to men in doing that situation is, it's like it's like a prevent defense in the fourth quarter. Maybe you won't give up a touchdown, but you're going to give up a lot of yards. Or you could be more proactive. You could be more like, I think what she's really about is wanting to feel more connected with me. And it's just taking the form of these complaints about things I'm not doing. But I think what she's really trying to tell me is she's trying to get closer to me. And we've gotten stuck in this pattern where she's the only one who keeps asking for closeness, and I'm always playing the prevent defense. Well, if I turn that around and I start being more proactive and saying, hey, honey, we haven't been out for a while. I made us reservations at a really nice restaurant, and I got us a hotel for the night too. You start doing things like that, I think that you'll find that the other problem largely dissolves.
Interesting. So your work in experiential psychotherapy, can you go into what that type of work is and how you've contributed to that work?
Well, it goes back quite a ways. That's work I was doing. I mean, I still do it, but I started in the 90s because I had a wonderful teacher who was one of the founders of experiential psychotherapy, who was in his 70s at the time, and really almost nothing. See, there again, I'm wanting to research things and write about things that nobody's talking about. There was almost nothing written. And so I was really the person who sort of took all of their stories and coalesced them into a coherent theory and framework in the book that you're talking about. And it's basically an approach to psychotherapy that is, you could probably see in most other approaches, people don't understand that it's there. But it was really the first approach to psychotherapy that really emphasized the relationship between the patient and the therapist, and the relationship in a very deep, not just cognitive way, but a deep unconscious to unconscious way. And that work, emotionally focused therapy is very popular now. That work used to be called experiential psychotherapy. The founder of emotionally focused therapy readily acknowledges how much he took from experiential. So it's sort of like a hidden part of your family tree. It's there and not many people know about it, but it has a lot to do with what's going on in the field now. And the Change Happens book is the public's version. If anybody's interested in knowing more, I wouldn't read the experiential psychotherapy book. That's really written for therapists. The Change Happens book is really a more layperson's version of what we're talking about.
Oh, great. So are those techniques used in psychoanalysis settings with clients, for example?
All the time. And people may not even know that they're using them.
So what does that look like? What are some techniques that could be used?
It's not really about techniques. In fact, experiential sort of shies away from techniques. So I can't really answer the question in that way. It's really much more focused on the relationship, with the idea being that most of the things that people are unhappy about in their lives have to do with relationships. In one way or another, they have to do with relationships. And so if you're going to work through those things to a better place, if you got into these messes through a relationship, you're probably going to work them through in a relationship. So it's using the relationship between the two people in the room, the patient and the therapist, to help rework some of the relationship unhappiness in your life. So if you come to see me in therapy and you're feeling isolated and like you're not connected to a lot of people, that would happen with us. There would be ways in which you would struggle to make a connection with me, and that's what I would work with you on. And you'd learn about how to make a deeper connection with other people, which you could then take into your other relationships. So we'd work it in the room between us. And that's why I do a lot of groups, because people can work it in the room with each other and then take it out. We have somebody who's leaving a group just this week who said, people are saying, why are you leaving the group? He said, because when I came into a group, I had nobody in my life, and I learned how to make close relationships. And I now have many close friends that I can talk with as openly as I talk with you. And we were like, okay, that's the goal. Sounds like you're ready to go.
Yeah, that's great. I always love it when people who may go to psychotherapy and benefit from it in a way where they're taking it for a period of time and they learn the techniques and tools that they need. And it comes to a point where they're able to tell their therapist that I've benefited from this very well and I don't need this anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. The same way, your job is to raise your kids and send them off to live their own lives. It's the same thing. You really don't want your 30-year-old kid in your basement playing video games. You want them out there meeting people, getting their own place, having a good life.
Yes. So, Dr. Weiss, we're coming on the end here. This has been a great episode. I think I found myself maybe taking the counter argument on maybe a lot of different ways, kind of pushing you at asking different questions. I hope that hasn't deterred you in any way.
Not at all. No, I enjoy that. That's part of my culture. So.
Good. Which you understand, like you said many times, you feel that with your work throughout your career, you've taken the different perspective on many different issues.
The road less taken. Yeah. The road less traveled.
So if you have any closing statements, that would be great.
I guess it's hard to think of how to sum it all up, but I'm very committed to understanding men in a sympathetic, affirming way. And there's a lot in the culture now which is not so committed to that, which takes a pretty negative, critical take towards men. And I think that gets in the way of a lot of intimate relationships. And so I encourage men to be more interested in understanding themselves in a more sympathetic, positive way. And I encourage women to be more open to a more sympathetic, positive understanding of men. We are in this boat together. And if we're going to figure it out, we're going to have to both work on it. We're going to have to understand both ends.
Sounds great. I love that. So definitely thank you for being a part of this episode, Dr. Weiss. What I like to always say is words paint pictures and picture is art. And hopefully we painted a good picture for individuals through our conversation.
Enjoyed it. Take care.